All right. Welcome all to my regular Friday show. I got up again very late today, which threw me off. I've only been up for about 45 minutes or so, but hopefully that doesn't hinder or impede my brain to where I can't get out all I'm wanted to discuss tonight, because I did want to discuss some different things. Um, this might not end up being as long as my normal Friday shows are, but I'll try and get out as much as I intended on getting out. You see, the title of it is Narratives and Other. Well, the narratives I wanted to discuss were the same narratives that I briefly discussed in my last video, not my audiobook video, but the one right before it, because there's some new narratives coming out about this whole thing going on over there. And I looked at this very thoroughly, and come to find out, it's your MSM media rags, these mainstream media outlets that are concocting these stories. The same mainstream media that's been lying about this whole Russia-Ukraine thing from the start. The main new narrative now being that Russia's doing a general mobilization of its people, which is patently false. They're mobilizing their reserves, not their people. It's not a general mobilization. You know, don't believe the lies. They haven't mobilized large parts of their reserves yet. So the 300,000 is not coming out of their general population. It's coming out of their reserves. So that's important for everybody to understand. And also, I seriously doubt it that people are fleeing Russia. That just doesn't even make sense. You know, we would do the same thing in a war. In fact, we did do the same thing. When I was in Iraq, do you know that we mobilized our National Guard and our reserves for that war because we had severe manpower shortages, which required us to do such? Because when you take troop rotations into account, you need to have the forces to do it. And we have not had a draft. We have not had a draft. Again, we have not had a draft since Vietnam. And everybody was so scared. I remember this. I remember this like it was yesterday. When that was going on, everybody was so scared that we were going to have a draft. Everybody was. But we never did. We never did. Why? Because we mobilized all our reserves and our National Guard and sent them. Russia's doing the same thing, folks. They're not even mobilizing all their reserves. They're mobilizing 300,000 of their reserves. So that's very, very important. It's important to understand that. Why? Because that's how armies work. That's how armies work. They don't mobilize their general population first. They mobilize their reserves first. That's the order of operations. So that fib, that lie they're telling, that Russia's doing a general mobilization, it's a complete utter joke. You know, you don't do a general mobilization until you've mobilized your reserves or whatever other forces you have, because we had National Guard as well. which, we have our reserves and our National Guard, which are two different components of our armed forces. Like Russia, they have reserves and they have their paramilitary as well. Their paramilitary is 300,000. Well, I'm not sure if their reserve. Well, I personally am sure that 300,000 number is coming out of their reserves, and it isn't talking about mobilizing all their paramilitary forces, because they've already had certain National Guard units. They've renamed their internal troops, which is their paramilitary, their 300,000 paramilitary forces. They called them their internal troops, and they renamed them the National Guard. And they've already sent a couple National Guard units. If you looked at a map of the Russo-Ukraine conflict, they've already had a few of their National Guard units, which is their paramilitary National Guard forces. They've had them on the map. So I'm sure that these 300,000 that Russia's talking about mobilizing is their reserves and not their paramilitary. That would make more sense. But again, this is just being talked about here recently, so I'm not even entirely sure myself. All I know is that on a map I've seen of the conflict, there have been a couple of those internal troops, or also known as National Guard, there. So that is a narrative being crafted that they are doing a general mobilization, when in fact they've not said anything of the sort. They're talking about mobilizing their reserves, because they already have a large enough active duty military. But the thing is that they have to have their active forces spread out for strategic flexibility. Russia's a big landmass. They're not going to send all their active duty forces into Ukraine. That wouldn't make any sort of sense. They would need forces elsewhere to deal with other threats, like alongside their borders with NATO and the Baltic, along Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and of course Poland in the Kaliningrad enclave. And, the troops they have in Belarus to support the Belarusian area of their border with NATO, because Belarus is an ally of Russia. So they would be supporting Belarusians, because they've had Russian troops in Belarus for quite a while to support their Belarusian allies. Also, they have Russian troops even as peacekeepers in the nation of Moldova, there along the the Dniester, what is that river? Transnistria. That's it, Transnistria. So they've got Russian troops in Syria as well, and I'm talking about active duty military forces, plus all their forces along the Arctic coast. On all these new Arctic bases they've built, and in the Russian Far East. Russia's a humongous nation. They have a lot of territory which they need to control. So they're not going to send all their active duty forces into Ukraine. That's why they've done their limited incursion, also called, according to them, it's called a special military operation. I just call it a limited incursion because it was a limited amount of troops with limited objectives that went a limited distance into Ukraine. They didn't occupy the entire country, not yet. But I see that it's coming to that point. So they're going to expand their objectives, because they're going to untie the hands of their generals and of their armed forces. So they're not doing a general mobilization. They're mobilizing their reserves. Okay, that's what's happening. That's what's really happening. So the referendum, as I've said in the other video, is all about making sure that they can integrate the captured territories with ethnic Russians into Russia, thereby causing the Ukrainians, because of course the Ukrainian objectives are to retake territories that they feel are theirs, causing them to thereby invade Russia. But, Ukraine doesn't have nukes. Ukraine doesn't have nukes, nor have they used any. So Russia's not going to use nukes. Russia and China have made it abundantly clear that the only way they would use nuclear weapons would be if the West used them if the West used them first. So that's what they've really been saying, okay? That's what they've been saying. It's not a threat to do a first strike. They never said that. They really never said that. That's a false narrative. They've never said they were going to do a first strike. So people that are like, "Oh my God, they're gonna nuke us," that's a recycled narrative. It's been recycled over and over again. Every other month, it seems like everybody's freaking out about being nuked. It's not going to happen like that. I went into detail 2 videos ago, the one before my audiobook. I went into great detail, and I've said this before. This isn't nothing new. I've said this for a very long time. Every other month, they're pumping that narrative for it's fear and hype, and agitation propaganda. The agitation and irritation propaganda comes into play when it comes to things like, "Oh my God, they're going to come after our firearms." They cannot physically do that, for one thing. And I've explained all of this extremely diligently in great detail in the past. They don't have the forces to go after everybody's firearms here. But that's besides the point. Right now I'm talking about this hype and whatever propaganda this is. This is where they recycled the same narrative every other month, it seems like. It's fear and hype, hysteria propaganda. They're not going to do a nuclear first strike until maybe when they invade. And even then, it's going to be very limited in terms of the types of nukes used and the amount of them. Because by type, I mean the yield of them, the actual yield of these things. They're not going to be these massive city killers being used because they don't want to destroy their objectives. I'm talking about the farmland. They don't want to contaminate it with radioactive isotopes, with cesium. They don't want to destroy all their resources they're trying to capture, their objectives, just in general. They're not trying to pollute the entire land with radiation. So they would use a small amount of tactical nukes. And that's really it. I would say a few dozen small tactical nukes. I never said they wouldn't use nukes. No, don't get it twisted. I never said they wouldn't. In fact, I've even had dreams of them using nukes. But they're not going to use a full-scale nuclear war. It doesn't happen like that. The Bible doesn't say it happens like that either. Even the Bible says that we're going to be invaded by massive armies. Massive armies. The city of Babylon and the nation of Babylon are 2 different things. So when it talks about the city of Babylon being gone in 1 hour, well, sure, yeah, maybe they got nuked. Maybe they're one of the places. But the nation of Babylon gets overrun by big, massive armies. And I'm sure there's some nukes, very limited numbers of them, and the very small tactical types that get used. Even in my dream, that's what it appeared to be. Small tactical nukes, Not these humongous ones that, totally annihilate just everything everywhere. Because I saw several of them in one of the dreams. Of course, when you're up closer to one of them, when they go off, like I was in one dream, it seems to be humongous. But when you're further away and you see them landing in all these different areas, They don't look as big. But that was a dream. I'm talking about in real life. In real life. In real life, they're not going to carpet America with nukes. That's not going to happen. The Bible doesn't even say that. The Bible says we're going to be invaded by armies. And the reality lines up with what the Bible says too in Jeremiah 50:51. Ezekiel even talks about World War III. The book of Ezekiel, the War of Ezekiel. That they don't say that we're going to just be outright destroyed with nukes. We're going to be invaded by armies, massive armies. And the reality lines up with that. Because in reality, we know that the foreign troops are packed inside of our nation on CCP properties, Chinese Communist Party properties. The Chinese armed forces are massive. I've told you all how big they are over and over and over again. So, yeah, it's just one of those things. It's one of those things. Yeah. Sorry, y'all. Hold on. I'm trying to do something here. Okay. But, anyway, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, y'all. I don't mean to be distracted. Trying to find something here. I can't find it. How's everybody doing? Let me look at the chat here. But yeah, we're going to be invaded by massive armies. We're not going to just be nuked outright. And these narratives they're recycling are ludicrous. They're ludicrous. Totally ludicrous. How's everybody doing? Yeah, Angry Scandinavian. It's state propaganda, to be sure. It's totally state propaganda. We're in a time of war, so we know they're going to use propaganda. Absolutely, absolutely. Because you got to understand, Ukraine is a Western proxy, so they have to support their proxy with their propaganda. Their propaganda always supports their either their proxies or their own forces if they're involved. That's just natural. That's natural for a time of war. You can't take any news stories you see, because you got to understand, these news media are the same people. They're the same people that basically have I mean, these news media are the same people that have said things like that. This is funny to me, okay? That Russia was running out of tanks and they're using their World War II tanks now. I'm sorry, but that's not what I see. Whenever I'm able to see images of the war, it looks like Russia has plenty of tanks left to me. When I crunch the numbers, when I actually go look at the numbers that they have right now, folks, they've only lost at very most like 300 tanks. 300 tanks. At most. At most. At absolute most. I'd say it's closer to 200, but they've lost like 300 actual main battle tanks, okay? Main battle tanks. I'd say it's closer to 200, but I'm saying at absolute most. We won't really know the exact number until after this is all over with, when they finally release everything like documentaries on the war, when they release all the statistics of everybody's losses, when it's finally over and done, everybody will see exactly how wrong all these news media stories were about it all. But the best estimate is between 200 and 300 tanks is Russia's real tank losses. They took Images from a Russian tank museum. I'm talking about Western media sources. Took images from a Russian tank museum that gives people rides on older tanks, and they said that those are the tanks that Russia's using now. Laughable. Completely laughable. Totally unrealistic. Totally unrealistic. In a limited incursion with limited numbers of troops involved, it is physically impossible to lose 20,000 tanks, much less 20,000 vehicles, because they didn't bring that many vehicles. We're talking 70 battalions of troops. 70 battalions of troops. They may be at top, like absolute most, 70 battalions now. At absolute most, they've possibly brought with them about, 3,000 vehicles tops. 3,000 to 4,000 vehicles. 63 to 65,000 troops. 3,000 to 4,000 vehicles would be about right. And that's all types of vehicles. We're talking mostly trucks for their the logistics or troop transportation, MRAPs, engineering vehicles, air defense artillery vehicles, radar vehicles for the ADA, and also for their artillery, because they have fire direction control radars for their artillery. We're talking about the self-propelled artillery pieces, the vehicles that towed artillery, rocket artillery vehicles, tanks, APCs for carrying the mechanized infantry troops, and IFVs for giving the mech infantry fire support. We're talking about tanks. We're talking about just everything in general, just all the support vehicles that go with all the stuff that I just mentioned. So, yeah, realistically, at absolute most, 200 to 300 tanks. That's all they could have possibly destroyed. And I'm sure about half of those were repaired. They were repaired and put back in service. Because sometimes tank losses don't end up being total losses, nor do other vehicles. Some vehicles are actually able to be repaired and put back into service. It happened with American vehicles in Iraq and Afghanistan, so it stands to reason that it would be happening with Russian vehicles too. So let's say that they're able to fix a quarter of all their losses. Let's say the tank losses were like 200, and they fixed a quarter of them. A quarter of 200. So they fixed 50 of them, okay? The total losses are then 150. The total losses. That doesn't seem as bad as 200. Or let's say it was 300. But they fixed, 75 of them. They fixed 75. So then the total loss would be what? 225, right? That doesn't even seem as bad as 300. So in real war, things get fixed. Vehicles can be fixed, at least a certain percentage of them. So all the losses that they talk about wouldn't even be total losses anyway. But there's no way that 20,000 tanks got destroyed, because Russia's tank fleet is 12,500. I'm talking about their main battle tanks. That's not including those light amphibious tanks they have, like what are those PT-76s or whatever they call those. That's not even including their light amphibious tanks they had. Their main battle tanks, they have 12,500. They have about 8,000 more, but those are in the boneyards. Most of those 8,000 cannot be refurbished. They're just rust buckets sitting there collecting more rust. Their engines probably don't even work anymore in most of them. Some of them, I'd say maybe about 1,000 or 2,000 of those 8,000 tanks could be fixed up, because they hadn't been sitting there that as long as other ones, like all these T-55s, the old T-54-55s. They're T-54/55s. Most of those have been sitting in there much longer than the T-64s or the small number of T-72s that they have sitting in there. But the proxies of the LPR and DPR forces in the Ukraine, Russia did fix up some of the fixable tanks and armed and equipped them with it and trained them on it. Those are the proxy groups that Russia has so far been trying to help in their little struggle to defend the eastern part, the Donbass of Ukraine. But now they're going to be shifting with these referendums. They're going to be shifting from a special military operation, what I like to call a limited incursion for its limited amount of troops involved, its limited aims and objectives, its limited area inside Ukraine, because they only had an incursion. They didn't stay. Their objective was not to occupy territory. While they did occupy some territory, that wasn't their main objective. Okay? It was not a full-scale invasion. It hasn't been a full-scale invasion to begin with. But the Western media, in their propaganda, has said it's a full-scale invasion when in fact it's not. It had very limited aims and objectives from the start. They're not trying to necessarily occupy territory. While they are occupying a little bit, because naturally they have to, because they're inside the borders, duh, they're not trying to do that as their primary objective, at least not now. But since they're bringing their limited incursion to an end, that could always change. Aims and objectives in warfare often change. They don't always necessarily stay the same. Plans are often tailored to the present reality. Because in war, you have to adapt and overcome different situations. Now, again, when I went to Iraq, and I didn't go to Afghanistan, but I went to Iraq. I know Afghanistan was very similar to Iraq in some ways. Talking about the types of, third world nations, both of them were, in that and in the tactics that the enemies used, they were very similar in those types of ways. But, the things that happened with regards to the types of conflict that Iraq was, we needed manpower horribly bad, because to occupy Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time would be the equivalent in land and population of occupying California and Texas. Just only those two states. Only those two states. And apparently, that was such a drain on our manpower that we had to resort to getting a lot of help from the domestic Iraqi puppet forces when I was in Iraq, and also from our foreign allies. And we had to bribe the local sheiks for their loyalty not to attack us. We had to bribe them not to attack us. We had to do all of that and use National Guard and Reserve on troop rotations, because our active duty forces were not big enough for the demands that came with occupying both of those countries, because you have to take troop rotations into account. We were not big enough to occupy what ultimately, and that was a day when our forces were bigger than they are today. Than they are even today. That we were bigger, we were larger then. We were larger and bigger. We were bigger. And that was still a drain on our manpower to where we had to mobilize our reserves and active duty. They didn't do a draft, but what they did do instead was they offered these humongous sign-on bonuses at the time to meet their manpower requirements for the active duty military as well as the National Guards and reserves. They did different sign-on bonuses to join all three components of our army. Okay? Of course, the other branches too had their own little recruitment pushes, like the Marine Corps and such, and because they, of course, they have their ground forces, as well as the Air Force and Navy, who weren't as they weren't recruiting as heavily, but they were still recruiting at that time too. But regardless of all of that, the Army and the Marines were doing big, large pushes for manpower, offering big sign-on bonuses. Man, you wouldn't even believe it. There were as high as 40,000 sign-on bonuses at the time for field artillery. For field artillery, the MOS that I was in, 13 Bravo, 40,000. You know why? I didn't know this until later, but it's because you can be used as infantry as well as artillery because they train you in both. They train you in both because you're part of the combat arms branches, which consist of infantry, artillery, and tankers. You're part of combat arms MOSs when you join artillery, which is 13 Bravo, or when you're a 19 Kilo, which is tankers, or when you're an 11 Bravo, which is infantry, that's their MOS. They have one MOS as infantry, but the tankers and the 13 Bravos, they have 2 for 1 because they get trained as infantry as a default setting, but also get trained in their proper MOS, whether it's artillery or whether it's a tanker. You see what I'm saying, right? What I'm relating this to now is I'm relating it to what's going on with the Russians. They, before doing a general mobilization, would most likely do something very similar to that if they had to, but they don't have to. They don't have to. Their reserves are 2 million. And then they have their 300,000 paramilitary troops. They're what they used to call their internal troops, which they now call their National Guard. Their active duty military, their Air Force, their Navy, and their Army are 1.2 million in size, 1.2 million. But their reserves are humongous at 2 million, 2 million, 2 million. Okay? They said they're mobilizing 300,000 to go into Ukraine. That's coming out of their reserves, okay? Those 2 million that they have as reserves, that 300,000 is coming out of that. They would still have another, some 1.7 million of their reserves if they had to mobilize them. They wouldn't have to do a general mobilization. That's what I'm saying. I mean, they might do a recruitment drive to maybe bolster their active duty numbers more if they felt they had to. But they don't have to do a general mobilization. Everybody thought that we were going to do that during Iraq and Afghanistan because it put such a strain on our armed forces. Okay? Everybody thought we would have to do that because it put such a strain on our armed forces. But we didn't do that. We didn't do that. We didn't have to do that. But it stretched our military to its breaking point back then, because we had to do troop rotations. We had to pull troops from all sorts of places, rotate them into Iraq, and then rotate them back to their home installations, wherever they were. just to fill the manpower requirements for occupying what ultimately equates to land mass and population that equals Texas and California. In land mass and population, combining Afghanistan and Iraq is like combining Texas and California. And it stretched our military to the breaking point when we had more people. Let me see what y'all are saying. So don't listen to these media narratives is basically what I'm getting at. The media doesn't even know what the hell they're talking about. Mary, how are you doing? And Rebecca and Jennifer and Angry Scandinavian. That's what he's doing. Angry Scandinavian. It's exactly what he's doing. It's exactly what he's doing. That's it. Sorry, everybody. I'm having some issues with the buffering here. But yeah, the Chinese, though, on the other hand, oh yeah, that the thumbnail, by the way, is just Chinese towed artillery firing their PL-66 howitzers, pretty big. They're only 152 millimeter howitzers, which are, pretty close to a 155, like what I was on in artillery. The Chinese both have the 152 and 155 howitzers, but basically, yeah, that's a large howitzer. 152 is a large howitzer. Both Russia and China have even larger howitzers like the 203 millimeter, which are massive. Those are massive shells, even bigger than the 155. But yeah, I thought that would be a good thumbnail there because of all the war and rumors of war. And mainstream media, they love to be a pusher of the rumors of war narratives, as it suits them, of course, as it suits them. Now, if you all have watched the videos that I posted from the two recent posts from the Duran channel, they had a guest on. Now I don't much care that they believe in the political stuff. I think that's a farce, of course. You know that politics is fake. You know that as well as I do. So I don't pay attention when they talk about the political commentary stuff. But when it comes to how the situation with the as it relates to what's going on in Europe, when it comes to that, when it comes to them talking about how Europe and America are going to collapse, when it comes to the issues as it relates to Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan, I pay good attention, very close attention, good attention to them, because they do know what they're talking about in relation to these Chinese and Russian regimes. They do know what they're talking about. And they also know that the West is going to collapse very soon. Very soon. If you listen to the guest in the newest one, he even says that, he said even if Europe somehow made it through the winter, what are they going to do next? What are they going to do next? They've already collapsed their whole economies. So what are they going to do? What are they going to do in the next 5 years, 10 years, if the world lasts that long? What are they going to do? They will never come back from this, the Western Europeans, nor will America. They will never, ever come back. So, He's right about that. And I'm talking about the guest. The guest that was on the newest one I posted from them, he was right about that much. Now, I know the left-right paradigm, and you know I hate the left-right paradigm. I know that it's a false globalist paradigm. But it was paradoxical to me that even though it's paradoxical to me that even though this guy acknowledged that there were technocrats, neocons, which are the elites, in other words, even though he acknowledged that there are the Western elites, what he didn't acknowledge was that this left-right paradigm is utterly controlled by them. Utterly, completely, totally controlled by them. I don't know why he wouldn't just say that in that video, but the politics wouldn't make a lick of difference as to how the country would continue on as it relates to these elites, because the elites control the politics of the Western nations. Now, obviously, we know they don't control China and Russia. As I've, diligently shown everybody, I broke it down into details using historical examples and dates of specific items, and how it relates to the East and the West being two entirely separate entities, and entities as it relates to elites. The Eastern and Western elites are both very different. If they were one, if they were unified, we would already be under a world system, a one world government. There wouldn't be any wars, except wars just strictly against the people that would try to resist them, maybe, but there wouldn't be any more wars between nations because all the nations would be unified. But we know that's not true. I know it not only because I know the history, but I know it also based on common sense. Common sense. Because China and Russia want to take over the West. They want to take us over and colonize us. Like I was saying earlier, like I've always maintained, they want to take us over and colonize us. They've said it, and their actions show it by buying all these properties in the case of China so that they can base their troops, importing their troops. They want to take us over and colonize us. They want to have their own new world order. They are the physical manifestation of the dragon, Satan. They're the physical manifestation in the Bible, whereas Satan is the spiritual manifestation. But we know that Satan has firm control over China. Why? Because China is a despotic, communist police state regime that worships their state, as in their nation state, their regime. They worship their nation state and its leader as a god, a little g god. They're the most powerful nation in the world. Irrefutable, undisputable. China is the most powerful nation on earth. In real numbers, real terms, real everything, real technology, real capabilities. They're the world's superpower, and they will be until the end of time. Russia is the number 2 nation after China in terms of overall power, but China's the most powerful, okay? So that's undisputable. But we, on the other hand, are the credit card that has nothing left on it. We're living on our past reputation. Oh yeah, you still got the credit card itself, but you ain't got shit on it. It's that sort of situation. We're going to be taken over by China and all their allies, including Russia. So that day's coming. That day's coming. That's the reason, folks, why I write my stories That's the reason why I've made my documentaries, to highlight what the Sino-Russian doctrines look like, using nothing but straight facts to illustrate it. Straight fact to illustrate it. 100% facts. Now, I've shown, even in my audiobook, how this looks on the ground level. The last several chapters especially are really starting to get into some of the nitty-gritty, as the main characters all are beginning to find themselves in dire straits. Even though they've been in dire straits since the beginning, they're finding, is what I'm trying to convey here, is that they're finding that they're running out of places to go. They're running out of places to go. I'm showing you the realities of war. I'm showing you what happens when you run out of communications, you run out of ammunition, you run out of the ability to get to your logistical points because you've been cut off. You've been cut off from your logistics. I'm showing you what it's like when you can not really organize effectively because you have no more communications. I'm showing you what it's like when you can no longer coordinate effectively. I'm showing you what it's like when you don't have the adequate weapons you need to fight aircraft or tanks or whatever else. I'm showing you what it's like when the enemy has artillery support and you don't, and you don't. So let's look at this. I just want to show you something real quick. This is going to be a visual here. All right? It's going to be a visual. In the last story, I was showing you. See, I'm every third story, instead of every year, it's every third. You know, there's 3 parts of each story where I rotate them here, 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 here. Like, you know, one features what's going on in this area. This is the cap city. You see the city limits, you know, right there. If you've seen a map, you've seen the Potomac River, you've seen the city limits like that. And these are the suburbs out here. You know, there's Alexandria and Arlington. You've seen a map. There's the highways, these dark lines. Like there's 495. There's 95. And there's the rest of 95. If you've known this area that I'm showing you, then here's the part where I'm talking about the pocket that was being created. Here's the Anacostia River, right? Here's the Anacostia right here. These are the mixed military that were getting trapped in a pocket, okay? Earlier, he had to sneak. I'm talking about the character that I highlighted, Sergeant Richardson. He drove all the way back with his Lieutenant Colonel Larson before they died in the attack by the 31st Group Army's subunits. Like these are all battalion units that are subunits of the 92nd, and down here's the 93rd. These are divisions. Now the 86th was busy further east capturing other cities like what's that one? Not Anniston. Oh yeah, it was Anniston. No, Ann Arbor. I'm sorry. They were capturing Ann Arbor to the east. I get Ann Arbor and Anniston confused when it comes to Maryland. Now, that's along the Chesapeake, because there's a big bridge there that crosses the Chesapeake Bay also. They needed to capture that city, plus the Naval Academy's even there. But now, when we go here, these are the forces that were getting surrounded, that had the battle. You see, they were trying to flee down into the city where they'd be safe, but ended up, you know, as they crossed a bridge further up, they were going down this way, and they were hit by the forces of Private Lee, who were trying to cross the bridge. They were trying to flee this pocket that had been created, When these battalions here went down the highway, you know, and they went into the, I'm sorry, these battalions here, they were up surrounding the base earlier. Well, they went down this way, and punched as far into the city limits as they could. They got into the actual city limits before they finally ran into the defense line that was hastily thrown up by all available troops that could stop them. Okay? Now up here were the forces trying to escape from Private Lee's forces in the last chapter. Okay? They were trying to break out and go down this way somehow. They were trying to sneak. But it was too late, because by the time they'd reached the bridge and crossed it, they were pretty much surrounded by the rear echelon elements of these two battalions whose forward elements were punching deep into the city. But their echelons stretched further back, their rear echelons, and they were running into it. They were being surrounded and caught in a pocket, basically. So Sergeant Richardson, who was a bit further over here, he was looking for a way to break over here to get to the station in Silver Spring, the Metro Line station, who was being guarded by these mixed SWAT team paramilitary forces who were trying to hold it as long as they could, but their lines were beginning to fall apart because they were getting pummeled by aircraft and artillery and everything. You see, the city was basically, it was like a Berlin situation, like a Battle of Berlin situation. So it was very serious, you know. It was very serious. You know, there were 3 defense lines in the city. It was a lot like the Battle of Berlin at the end of World War II, where the Soviets showed up and had one final showdown with Hitler and Nazi Germany. But this was a very similar concept. See, the Chinese and their allies cleared all the outer bases. See here, you got Andrews, the air base. You got Indian Head, the naval base. These are all bases that surround the capital. You got what is this one? The Fort George over here. You got Fort Meade here. And then, of course, you had Quantico further off the map, but that was dealt with by the Belarusians, who were coming up this way, who made it a little later in the battle by, like, the end of day 2 to help the Pakistani forces and the Chinese massive group army here that was going in. And, of course, you had strategic, heavy aircraft here, plus the tactical fighter bombers here, the strike aircraft. You even had fighters, and when the fighters couldn't find any air targets, of course, they started strafing the ground in the city, trying to hit all the American lines and such that were defensive lines inside the city itself. So that is just one aspect of the stories, but I rotate to show what urban conflict as well as rural conflict and even suburban conflict looks like. The purpose of which is to show people, is to highlight the importance of knowing how to get out of those situations, knowing how to get to safety, knowing what real warfare is like, so that I can shatter misconceptions that so many people have, that they're going to just run out there by themselves and be a one-man show with a shotgun, of all weapons. I have heard people say stupid things like that, too. They think they're going to be a one-man show. You know, it's like Bubba Beergut, who thinks they're going to be like a one-man show, who's not in shape at all, who's going to run out there and go up against a highly motivated, highly disciplined, highly well-equipped and trained force without any sort of... They're going to fight them, but they're going to fight them with a shotgun, with no body armor. They're not in shape. They have no communications. They have no backup. They have no help. They have no anti-tank weapons, but they're going to somehow go up against all these concentrated forces. Totally unrealistic. Totally unrealistic. Total fantasy. Fantasy. That's why I show what this stuff looks like in real life, to shatter all the false misconceptions that so many people have. So many people have. You know, that's not how wars are fought. Wars are nothing like the video games portray it. You're not going to be a one-man show that goes up against the Ch1na armed forces. No. You have to have teamwork. You have to have the equipment. Like, you've got to at least have some protective equipment. You've got to have a good sturdy rifle. You got to be highly trained. You got to know tactics, like I've tried to show people, like I've tried to teach people with diagrams so that they could actually go out and practice it. Most Americans are not trained in any of this stuff, minus the war veterans and the people that actually have experience in combat, like myself and others I know personally. You know, I mean, look. Most Americans have no idea. They're very naive to war. So much so that the noise of it, the sheer noise of it, would horrify them. Probably cause them to have heart attacks. When you combine the noise and the ground shaking from all the shells landing, I mean, it would scare the shit out of people to the point to where they would have heart failure. I'm serious. I'm serious about that. Some people would, because they don't have any idea what that's like. They've never experienced anything remotely like it. They're going to be the people that think they're going to be Call of Duty characters. Those are going to be the ones that are cowering in a corner, you know, sitting in the fetal position, you know, hiding in a corner. They're not going to know what to do. That's why I'm trying to teach people that don't have any sort of experience, never been there, never done that, never experienced anything like it. I'm trying to show those people how it'll look, what it'll be like, and what to do, how to evacuate, so that you're not the one that's cowering in a corner waiting for them to come and get you and snatch you up or eliminate you. I'm trying to show people how not to be that person that's cowering. I'm trying to show people what it looks like so that when it does happen, that they're not going to be the ones acting all scared. You know, that they're going to expect it. They're going to understand what it'll be like, how loud it'll be. I mean, even though people still haven't experienced it, at least if they know what's coming, they can start being a little bit more desensitized, which that'll help you survive. If you're desensitized to it, it'll help you be able to escape so that you're not caught off guard, so that you're not paralyzed in fear, so that you can get your ass up and move your ass from place to place without being scared and stuck in a fetal position or in some frozen position. Because if you're not moving, you're gonna get wiped out. Straight up, you're gonna get wiped out. I also show people in that work how important logistics are. Get your logistics in order. Have caches where you've cached away items and supplies. People still don't understand how important that is. You run out of everything. You run out of food. You run out of water. You run out of ammunition. You have to have a way to get more. If you keep everything in a central location and it gets overrun or destroyed, then what? Then what? Then you're shit out of luck. Then you're shit out of luck. You're shit out of luck. So what are you going to do then? Huh? What are you going to do then? Have anybody even thought about these things? Has anybody thought about that? People better be thinking about it. Because that's all very real. It's all very real. It's very real. So all that work, all the work I do on this channel to show people where I combine my personal experience with all that I've studied and blend it all into a work of art, but also a work of practicality where it's practical, where it'll help other people to see what these things are really like, where it'll shatter misconceptions, because people who haven't experienced the third world, people who haven't experienced war, they don't know no better. They don't know what this is going to be like. All they have is misconceptions. They don't know shit about shit when it comes to war. So I try to do my best to educate people, but it seems like a lot of people don't even see the utility of it. And that's a damn shame, because there's more utility in that than there is in a lot of other stuff. So, yeah, I'm low budget. I admit it. I'm low budget. I'm extremely low budget here. But I work with what I've got. And if I have to draw my own artwork for the concept art, if I have to draw my own maps for the documentary battles, that still counts for something. Counts for a lot. If I have to write stories to convey what it'll look like on the ground, that still counts for a lot. Who else is doing that? Sure, a lot of people are talking about when we're going to be invaded, but who is actually showing you what that's going to look like with real everything, real units, real equipment, real everything? Who else is doing that? People can talk about it all they want, but who is actually showing you what it's mechanically going to look like with mechanics, with real everything? Who is showing you what it's going to look like with real doctrines, strategies, tactics, how it'll mechanically work with logistics and communications, coordination, battle strategy, real vehicles, real everything? Who else is doing that? Nobody. Not even Steve Quayle does that, and he's been talking about it for a long time. He's been talking about the invasion coming for a long time. But I actually show you what it'll look like and how it'll work. Why? So that you can survive it, because I'm all about solutions. I mean, yeah, I'd be lying if I thought that everybody was going to make it. You have to be in shape. You got to be in some kind of shape, But at least you'll have a chance. At least you have a chance if you can shatter misconceptions, and you can use that to your advantage. You can shatter misconceptions, and you can use that to your advantage. You can make realistic planning, realistic emergency planning, shit hit the fan planning, war planning when this happens. You can actually know what to expect, how it's going to work, how it's going to look, how it's going to move, and you can make your plans around that. There ain't nobody else showing you what I show. I haven't found nobody, not one person yet. I'd like to, because I'd like to compare notes with them, maybe do a collab, maybe collaborate with them, do some kind of collaborative work. But I haven't found nobody yet doing what I do. So, take advantage of all the material on this channel. I even organized it all for you in playlists, in my playlist tab. All the typed out stories, though, they're going to be in the community tab, but that's why I'm doing an audiobook for those who don't scroll back and read those. They're very good stories to read. If you have a PC or a laptop, that'll help you read them a lot easier because a PC and laptop, you can scroll back a lot easier than you can with a phone to read each part, because each post is a part. You start from the bottom and read up in terms of each part of each story. All you got to do is look at the title of the story. It'll tell you what part it is, what story it is, and you can read up. I made about 4. Now, one is extremely short and is only consisting of 2 parts, which are 2 posts, but the rest are much longer. The first one being the longest, the second being the second longest, the third being the third, and then the fourth being the least longest. But I also made the audiobook for those who just don't like to read. I'm still working on the audiobook, but it's coming along nicely now. It's coming along nicely. Now that I did the character development and main introductions, now I'm getting into the meat of it, where it shows the extremity, the extreme of the battles. And it'll continue to pick up pace from there until it hits its climax point and then goes into the finale, where I say what happens at the very end. But take advantage of all the resources on this channel while you're still able to do so. Because time is running out, to be sure. Time is definitely running out. Like the internal conflict documentary, so much of that is coming true. So much of it is coming to pass already. If you haven't watched that, that's a work of art too. It starts off with the collapse of the food, fuel, economy, and finance, which leads into everything else. And so much of that is already coming to pass in real life. In real life, all around us. I've shown you many times how that's the case. I've shown you real examples and compared those real examples to what I put in that documentary, which I made well before a lot of those examples have even come to pass. They all began to coalesce, just like in my documentary, of the internal conflict, the Syrian style, meaning with factions, sectarian, internal conflict. I've shown how so much of it is coming to pass. I made that even before any of it has. I did really solid research that helped me to compile something that resembles the closest thing to the actual reality that you're ever going to see before it happens. Before it happens. They're all in playlists. All the documentary work is in their own playlists. Now, all the invasion work is all on the same timeline, meaning it's the same event, happens at the same time, same timeline, but it's a different timeline than the internal conflict. See, in the internal conflict, when we have a collapse, a total meltdown that leads into that, then it ends with basically the whole nation running out of resources and, then we get invaded. It goes from like the very last big, large campaign that happens, then it just descends into a few more weeks of just low-intensity conflict, and then we get invaded by China and Russia and their allies. That's the timeline of the internal conflict documentary, but that's a different timeline. See the invasion work I've done, that happens as if we didn't have a collapse and we did not have an internal conflict. So we did not have either a collapse or an internal conflict. We just got invaded. Like we're living in a time like right now at the time I'm making this video, and we just get invaded. Like it's relatively calm and then all of a sudden we get invaded. Whereas in the internal conflict, we have a complete total collapse, total meltdown. And then we have an internal conflict and then we get invaded at the end of that. It's invasion with the same doctrines, same everything as I've shown in my invasion documentaries, but here's the thing. It happens after we have a internal conflict and meltdown, economically, financially, food, fuel, all that. And yes, they can still do the same things with their CCP properties after we have an internal conflict as they could even if we didn't have an internal conflict. Why? Because during an internal conflict, this country will be so chaotic, there's going to be no way to stop these very powerful, very potent Chinese and Russian units and other units that are sitting on these CCP properties. Anybody that would wander near those properties would just get annihilated and never heard from ever again. So that's the way that they'll still be able to do that. Plus, the communications situation would be so bad, it's not like they'll be able to tell anybody about these forces that are on these properties. They'll just get annihilated and never heard from again. That's why they'll still be able to use the same fourth generation hybrid war doctrines as they would if they did it on the timeline I had them on, where it happened without an internal conflict and without an economic meltdown happening. The only difference is with the internal conflict is that, it was just one different timeline where we had that happen and then we got invaded after it. So let me see what people are saying before I get off for the night here. All right. No, Angry Scandinavian, I'm not. Copper's Cove was right outside of Fort Hood. That was I used to be. Basically, I used to be. So, I'm not anymore. All right, let's see here. Well, what my thoughts about 924? I don't really have any. I mean, what's there to think of, really? I mean, I don't look at dates. I look at events. I'm not one that's ever really found dates fascinating. I always find the events themselves to be fascinating, Anything can happen at any time is what I'm saying. I don't expect there to be anything on any specific date because, I don't date set. Hey, Jeffrey, what's up, man? Yeah, I don't date set, but also, hey, Steven. And, yeah, I don't date set. I'm not a date person, but I look at the events themselves that lead into other events. Like, you would have basically a sort of a warning based upon the events leading into other events. Like, for instance, a collapse. You would have the food and fuel collapse leading into other events, like an economic and financial collapse, which that will all coalesce about the same time, as I've said before. And that'll lead into the internal conflict. So that's going to be basically it as far as that. And then the internal conflict will lead into the foreign invasion. Just like in the book of Jeremiah says, and just like reality seems to stipulate. Even Dmitry Duduman said the same thing. Even he said the same thing. He said that, there's going to be, from the middle of the country, well, look at my internal conflict map. What was happening in the middle of the country, except for the very fringes of it, and well, until the very end anyway. In the middle of the country, they rose up and they took over. These different factions all rose up and took their own piece of the country. And they started fighting the regime and each other. It was a multi-way internal conflict, just like in Syria. And on the very fringes of the nation where you had the, you had the regime. The regime held parts of the Northeast. They held little islands here and there. And they also held the West Coast. Only at the very end where was the regime really starting to lose a lot of territory. Well, I'd say from about the middle to the end, because the middle also seen the NSRF advance really, really close to the cap when they advanced from Martinsville all the way to Lynchburg. They moved an entire 75 miles, which is good for considering all they had was animal transport and very, very little fuel, which they had to use only during the campaigns, the battles for their vehicles, because they didn't want to waste fuel. They wanted to conserve as much fuel as possible. So by and large, they used a lot of animal transport to move the fuel forward to the units. I mean, of course, they had to load things up on truck and train here and there, but by and large, they mostly use animals to transport the logistics that had nothing to do with transporting vehicles themselves, like ammunition, food, fuel. They loaded all that up on animal transport. In World War II, you saw a lot of that. When Germany was running low on fuel, they resorted to using a lot of horse-drawn logistics. It took a while to get places, but it still worked. You had a lot of that happen. So, you had to get to that point. Let me see what else is being said here. Big Mike and yep. Yeah, I agree, Rebecca, definitely. I agree. Yeah, I watch events. I'm an event watcher. I'm not really like a date watcher. Never really have been. I more watch events because events tell you when other events are going to happen mostly. All right. I have to push buttons. I'm sorry. Let's see what's being said here. I've been gone a while, so I'm going to get off here pretty soon. But that visual I gave you earlier, so that you can sort of see on the map where the characters are, they're very close to each other. I'm talking about the PLA, the Chinese PLA soldier that's a main character, and also Sergeant Richardson, who's trying to evade being captured or seen by the PLA forces, who's trying to escape to the underground metro, the metro station, so he can escape underground in the story. They're very near. Their units are very nearby each other. Well, I should say Sergeant Richardson isn't so much in a unit anymore, but he's like a survivor of his unit being pretty much decimated in battle. But he's trying to evacuate to get out of the hot zone so he can get under the metro station and, travel in the underground tunnels. Obviously he can't take the train because the power grid is out from the Chinese cyber attack. Also from the anti-satellite weapons and other issues. So he has to walk under the tunnels to get further south to the friendly front lines inside the city. Because this is like the Battle of Berlin. In Berlin, in the Berlin Battle in 1945, the Germans were using the S-Bahn. Now the S-Bahn, or the S-train, was like their subway. It was like their subway train system, basically. Now the Germans were using their S-Bahn to transport troops and logistics all around the city, so that they could get ammunition and supplies and food to people. They used the S-Bahn to be able to travel under the city safely so that they wouldn't be seen by Russian aircraft, or I should say Soviet aircraft, or hit by Soviet artillery or whatever, tanks, troops. The same is the case in this battle for the Cap City. They're using the metro line to transport troops and logistics and also so that civilians can hide underground and use it as a way to stay out of the artillery shelling and the carpet munitioning from the Chi-Com strategic heavy bombers, and also the tactical ground attack aircraft that do precision strikes on specific areas. So they're using that metro line to hide underground. Whether it's troops, logistics, or refugees that are trying to hide from all the combat that's going on above in the city. So the part of the story, if you've listened to it, is articulating that there's a group of troops trying to escape a pocket. Now, these are different troops than the small, tiny group that Sergeant Richardson's with, but these guys are trying to escape a pocket that was earlier created by the advancing Chi-Coms moving into the outer suburbs. Two battalions, their lead elements, went straight into the city limits of the cap itself, but the outer suburbs is where a lot of the fighting's happening at the current moment of that story taking place. Well, Sergeant Richardson is trying to weave his way through the city with survivors in Silver Spring, and he's trying to make it in the suburb of Silver Spring. He's trying to make it to the metro station so that he can walk south all the way to safety behind friendly lines. See, that's what's trying to happen in the story. Now, as for the group of troops that got stuck in the pocket almost, see, the pocket was closing by Private Lee's forces of his company and his whole battalion, because the battalion is made up of 8 different companies. The fire support company that was using their heavy 120 millimeter mortar assault guns to rain shells down as mortars. They can be used as a direct assault gun, or they can even traverse their turret high enough to be used as a heavy mortar system. Well, the fire support company of Lee's battalion was the one that was raining the heavy mortar shells down, while Lee's mechanized infantry company of his mechanized infantry battalion was the lead elements trying to seize the bridge so that the rest of the battalion could cross the bridge of his battalion and close the loop, close the pocket. And the American troops were trying to escape that pocket. Those troops that were mixed unit troops, they were trying to escape the pocket as it was closing. They were on the west bank, and the just west of their west bank positions were other Chinese forces, but they were the ones that were heading further south, and Lee's forces were the ones that were supposed to link up with those to close the pocket and trap those American forces. See, that's what I was showing on the map. Now, Sergeant Richardson, on the other hand, was trying to bob and weave his way through these alleyways and cross streets without getting totally annihilated and spotted. And that's what others were trying to do as well. And they were trying to make it to the metro station in Silver Spring, which was being held by these, paramilitary forces of the Americans, these SWAT-type forces. And they were the ones that were getting viciously assaulted by the Chinese, by their air power and also by artillery and other elements. But they were beginning to lose their position holding that metro line. So Sergeant Richardson was trying to make it to the metro line before they lost that metro line entrance. If they would have lost the metro line entrance, then he'd be stuck and probably eliminated. But he was trying to get there so he could travel safely underground to safer parts of the city. I hope that makes sense to people if they didn't already understand that. But that story is getting into great detail about the conflict, about the invasion, and is showing people what that type of thing really looks like. That's what a full-scale war would really look like, where we get invaded with fourth-generation warfare doctrines. That's exactly the types of stuff they would do. There would be one final sort of like Berlin-like battle, to take a city like that. Absolutely, there would be, because they'd be in a rush to sure end something. Like they'd be in a rush to end that conflict, because it was only a 4-day-long conflict. If you've watched the documentary, the 96-hour invasion documentary, then I actually showed. There were like 5 or 6 videos just on the battle for D to the C for the Cap City. That was a long battle. I showed it from each day how it developed. Each of the 4 days, from day 1 all the way to the last day. But yeah, it was a 4 day long affair. Well, the whole invasion of the country was, but that battle was too. If you wanted to watch that, that's called 96-Hour Invasion, and it's the Battle of the Cap City. There's many battles in that. It's closer to the middle of that documentary. I have a lot of different battle maps in that documentary series. It's in my playlists, like all the rest of the documentary work. The Northwest one, the Pacific Northwest playlist, that's also basically just a continuation of the 96-Hour Invasion playlist. It's just in its own documentary because it's more there to highlight the effect of terrain on massive troop movements as opposed to, focusing entirely on human settlements and also, the logistics and the, key routes and everything and the infrastructure and installations. I mean, while there is a battle for an installation in the Pacific Northwest one, it's mostly there to focus on the mountain battles that occurred there. But if anyone's interested, all of that's in the playlists. You can look at everything. Also, the civil conflict documentaries in there too, which is very long, and you should set aside a whole day. The first video of it is just storytelling, and the second video is where the actual maps begin after like about halfway through, because the halfway through part of it is storytelling as well. It's continuing basically from the first video, and then you'll see the maps and then the economies and how they developed and each faction's area. And also they'll talk about the leaders. I talked about the leaders in it, and the factions themselves, their forces and everything. It's very good. It's very well made. It's probably one of my favorite ones I made out of all of them. They were all good work, but that one included so many different aspects into one series. It was very well done, in my opinion. It had storytelling and maps and more, all in one work. That's why I liked it so much. Hey, Just Man, how you doing? Yep. Well, everybody. Hey, Kathy, how are you doing? Well, everybody, you all have a wonderful night. Thank you all for coming. You all be blessed.